Britain has always been very good at heritage. The castles, the postcard villages, the ancient market towns. It's practically
Hidden
a national
among the
industry.
branches of winter,
There are guidebooks,
these crumbling
television programs,
the grandeur
entire
of the
agencies
structure.
dedicated to preserving
This
the past.
hyper-realistic view
But not
reveals
all
the
of the
silent
past.
battle between
Scattered
the
across
resilient
this
plant
country,
and the
from the
decaying
Dorset
wall.
coast to the Derbyshire hills, from the Suffolk shoreline to the plains of Wiltshire, there are places that appear on maps, but not in the tourist literature. Towns with names, with postal histories, with streets that once had children playing in them. Empty now, some of them forcibly so. This is not a video about picturesque decay. It's not about nostalgia. It's about decisions. Who made them, when, and why. Because the more you look at these places, the clearer something becomes. Abandonment in Britain is rarely accidental. It is frequently policy. 11 towns, 11 stories. And by the end, you'll start to notice a pattern that nobody in an official position is particularly keen to discuss. We begin where it feels harmless.
All right, take the next section
We won't
down.
end there.
We're on schedule to clear the main
They built
hall
this
by
place for the
Thursday.
wealthy to have somewhere to look at the sea. That was the entire plan. The Pease family, Quaker industrialists who'd made their fortune in railways, imagined a resort town on the North Yorkshire cliffs. Grand hotels, a promenade, a funicular railway to carry guests down to the beach without unduly taxing their legs. For a few decades in the Victorian era, it worked.
This
The right sort of
hyper-realistic
people
inspection
came.
reveals
The funicular
exquisite
still
detail
runs
of the
today, in
surviving
fact.
Baroque stonework.
One of the oldest water-balanced cliff lifts in the world, still ferrying passengers down to a beach that is, by any measure, almost entirely deserted. The problem was the railways, specifically when they stopped coming. The wealthy visitors who'd made Saltburn fashionable discovered in the early 20th century that there were other places to go. Warmer places, places you could reach without changing at Darlington. And so they left. And the East Cliff houses, those dark stone Victorian villas staring out over the North Sea, were left staring
By
at
the
nothing in
mid-Victorian
particular.
era, the five
Walk
towns
through
were a
East
centre
Cliff
of industry,
today,
though
and the
the cost was
sensation is
often
odd.
paid in soot and
Not
grime.
eerie, exactly. More like catching someone in the middle of a very long pause. The architecture is intact. The proportions
A
are still
pristine
handsome.
example of landscape
The windows,
architecture,
though,
marred
blank,
by the dark,
lightless,
oily contamination
facing a sea
swirling
that couldn't
at its
care
heart.
less. The resort that never came back from its last season. Remember this feeling. It's about to get considerably more complicated. This town was built to do one thing: mine coal and send it south. The collieries came first, the community came after. Terraced houses for the miners, working men's clubs, a school, a high street that existed because of what happened underground. The community was tight. That's not sentimentality. It's the kind of closeness that comes from working in darkness together, from sharing the particular anxiety of a job where the roof above you is not guaranteed to stay where it is. People knew each other in the specific way that comes from proximity and shared risk. Then came 1984, the strike, then the closures.
Built during the peak
Not
of the
just here,
Regency era,
across
this
Scotland,
magnificent house
across the north of
incorporates
England,
the original
across
Tudor
every
core,
community that
a
had
testament
organized
to
itself
centuries.
around the
Cannot
extraction
leave
of
me
coal.
now, not after all we've shared.
The Thatcher government
My
had
honour
decided
demands
that
it, sir.
deep coal mining was uneconomical, and the decision was implemented with remarkable speed and very little apparent concern for what would happen to the tens of thousands of people
£60,000
whose
do I hear,
livelihoods,
70?
whose
No.
entire social
Going once,
structures
going
were built
twice,
around it.
and sold.
New Cumnock today has streets where more houses are empty than occupied. The Working Men's Club still stands, its signage faded, its purpose gone. Gardens have grown long. The silence is not peaceful. It has a specific quality, the silence of somewhere that used to be loud. Here the forces at work had names, ministers, policies, a deliberate restructuring of what Britain would and would not support. Saltburn lost its wealthy tourists to changing fashions. New Cumnock lost its reason for existing to a decision made in Westminster. That's a different kind of emptiness. On the 29th of May 1951, an explosion underground killed 83 men. The disaster at Easington Colliery remains one of the worst in British mining history. The families who lost people that
And
day
if we
are
follow
still
the
here.
old riverbed,
Some of them.
we arrive at the
Their
exact
children
spot
are.
where the estate
And
once
carved
stood,
into the stone of a
long before
memorial in the village
urbanization.
are 83 names, still receiving flowers. The colliery itself employed over 3,000 men at its peak. The town, around 10,000 people, existed in that particular symbiotic way of mining communities, where the pithead and the high street and the football ground and the school were all part of the same ecosystem. When the colliery closed in 1993, it didn't just close a workplace. It closed the thing around which everything else had been arranged. The headstock was demolished. The pit baths, the buildings, gone. But the town stayed. The houses, the streets, the churches, the pub where the miners drank on a Friday.
The ruins of the old hall
All of
perfectly
it
frame
is
its
still
successor,
there,
a
around an
testament to
absence
Elizabethan
where the
ambition
industry
and
used
the
to be.
enduring legacy of the family.
The football team still plays. On some Saturdays, they play to almost no one. There is a specific cruelty in a town that was allowed to survive, but not to recover. The memorial gets its flowers. But what Easington is really memorializing now is
The facade
itself.
of Hardwick New Hall remains
Hebden
perfectly
Bridge is the
intact.
kind of
Its
town
highly
that features in
detailed
weekend
stonework
supplements, artisan bakeries, independent bookshops, a thriving arts community. It managed something that very few post-industrial northern towns managed: reinvention.
They must have
And
wanted
good
to
for
show
it.
off their wealth.
But walk 50 meters east of the boutiques, and you'll find something the weekend supplements tend to leave out. The original textile mills, 5-story dark stone buildings that created the town, that gave it its reason for existing, that housed machinery operated by children from the age of 10. They're still standing. Most of them are still empty. Vegetation grows from the window frames. The machinery in some cases is still inside, rusting very slowly in the dark. Nobody quite knows what to do with them. They're too big to repurpose cheaply and too historically significant to
Here at
demolish
Lowther,
without a
the
fight.
architecture has been slowly,
So they exist in
beautifully
this
colonized
strange
by the
liminal
surrounding
state,
wilderness.
preserved by inertia, neither remembered nor forgotten. What Hebden Bridge decided to remember and what it decided to forget are not
Starting the
50
bidding at
miles
50
apart.
pounds, do I hear
They're
60,
50 meters
60?
apart.
Thank you, sir, at the back.
That
70 anywhere,
contrast,
going once, going
conscious
twice.
revival
Sold.
alongside conscious neglect, is about to become a theme. Except in the next case, the decision about what to forget was made by
The
someone
challenge
with
here is
considerably
balancing
more
the preservation
power.
of this incredible texture
Wentworth
with
Woodhouse has the
structural
longest
necessity
country
of the
house
modern
facade
steel
in Britain.
supports.
500 feet of Palladian stone, 30,000 square feet of floor space, 365 rooms. The Fitzwilliam family built it to make absolutely certain that everyone understood who was in charge. In 1946,
Brodsworth Hall,
the
a
newly
stunning
elected Labour
survivor
government
among losses,
granted permission
stands
for
perfectly
open-cast coal
preserved in
mining
the
to
West
begin
Riding of Yorkshire.
within
The
200
West Riding
meters
of
of the
Yorkshire,
house.
a landscape once
The decision
dotted
was
with grand
made
estates,
by Emmanuel
now largely
Shinwell,
emptied of its
then
historic houses.
Minister of Fuel and Power. It was, to put it gently, widely interpreted as political. The Fitzwilliams had been among
According
the
to this
most
map,
vocal
the bridge is
opponents of
secure.
nationalisation. The
Inform
mining
Captain
tore up
Davies,
the
we
grounds,
proceed as planned.
shook the house's foundations, and devastated the workers' village that had grown up in the estate's shadow. Many of those structures were demolished. Others
The systematic
simply fell.
dismantling of the estate required the heavy
The topography
machinery
of the
and
land
strenuous
was
labor
altered
characteristic of the
permanently
era.
by extraction
All right, keep moving on the
that
double.
most
Watch that
geologists
beam.
agreed,
The great estates of
even at
South
the time,
Yorkshire are gone,
was not
leaving
economically
only
necessary.
undifferentiated
It was
agricultural
coal
land.
as a message. The village workers paid the price of a political argument they weren't even part of. That is the moment, in this countdown, when the state stops being a
This deeply
passive
rutted
background
tract,
presence
once
and
the grand
becomes
approach
something
to the
more
estate,
active.
is now purely
From here
functional.
on, the stories get harder to explain as accident or oversight. On the 14th of September 1979, 8,000 people were made redundant from the Shotton Steelworks in a single day. It remains one of the largest single-day
The east
job
facade of
losses
Wentworth Woodhouse
in British
stretches
industrial
for an
history.
astonishing 600
The plant had
feet,
employed
making it
roughly
the
a
longest
third of the
country house
working
facade in
population of
England.
Flintshire.
The afternoon light
That
truly
number should
highlights
sit
the
with you for a
grandeur of the
moment.
facade.
It
What
is
happened
magnificent.
next is
A
what makes
testament to the
Shotton
estate's
different from New
enduring
Cumnock
legacy.
or Easington. The local council made a decision. Rather than maintain the workers' housing, streets of terraced homes built to serve the steelworks, they chose to demolish them. Entire residential quarters were knocked down.
The violence of the
land was
proximity
cleared.
is immediately
If you look
apparent,
at old
highlighting
ordnance
the
survey
tension
maps
between heritage
and then look
and
at what
resource
exists
demands.
today, You can trace the ghost of streets that no longer have any physical presence. Pavements that terminate at grass. Lamp posts with no houses to illuminate. The infrastructure of a neighborhood without the neighborhood itself. The previous towns on this list were allowed to decay. Shotton was actively removed. That is a different act entirely. Not neglect, but erasure. A deliberate decision to remove the evidence that a community had existed. And if that distinction unsettles you, the next 3 entries will give that feeling considerably more material to work with. Before the end of November 1943, 225 people lived in Tyneham.
Note the massive...
They farmed, they fished, they attended the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, whose origins date to the 13th century.
At its peak, the Baroque
They had
north
lived in this
facade of Hamilton
particular
Palace
pocket of the
rivaled even
Purbeck
the grandeur
Hills,
of Versailles.
in some families'
Truly
cases,
a British
for
masterpiece.
generations. On the 16th of December 1943, they were told to leave. The government needed the valley for tank training exercises
Under an overcast
in preparation
sky,
for
the
D-Day.
monumental task of
They were
demolishing
given
Hamilton
28
Palace
days.
continued.
They
a
were
stark
promised
symbol
they
of
could
the
return
historical
once
loss.
the war was over. When they left, a note was pinned to the door of the church. It read, "Please treat the village kindly. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating it well." The war ended in 1945. The Ministry of Defense did not return Tyneham. They announced in 1948 that the land would be retained for permanent training
The Hamilton
use.
Mausoleum Dome, built
The
for
villagers
permanence,
and their
truly
descendants
outlasts
petitioned,
everything it was
protested,
constructed
and
alongside
wrote
in this
letters
modern
for
suburban
decades.
park.
The ministry
years
held
left their
firm.
mark on the
The village
countryside.
is still there,
Requisitioned
frozen
estates like
more
this
or
one
less at
faced an uncertain
1943.
future amid the rubble.
The church has
the
its
crew worked
pews.
systematically,
The school
relying
still has
on
its
both
wall
brute
maps.
strength and the new
The houses
mechanical
stand with
advantage
their
of the bulldozer
fireplaces
to bring
intact,
down the massive
their rooms
structure.
emptied but structurally preserved. The ministry opens the site to visitors on certain weekends and bank holidays, under supervision. The note on the church door was answered with 80 years of silence. But there is a village 5 miles away, on Salisbury Plain, where the silence has been replaced by something rather more disconcerting. Imber was evacuated in November 1943, 10 days before Tyneham.
Generations.
Same story. Wartime necessity. Same promise of return. Same broken commitment. But what happened to Imber
precision of the
afterwards
line work
is
here
different
is
in a way
remarkable.
that is difficult to
These detailed
process
plans and
without
elevations are
standing
the
there.
sole
The
surviving
British
record of
Army
the house.
didn't just keep Imber, they kept using it actively. The village, its streets, its houses, its structures, has been used for decades as a training ground for urban combat. Houses have been modified to simulate enemy-held buildings. Windows have had firing positions cut into them. Some structures carry tactical numbering on their walls. The Church of St. Giles stands immaculate in the middle of all this. Medieval, Grade 1 listed, maintained by the Army. It is open to the public a handful of times per year. Controlled visits, escorted. The gravestones in the churchyard are still there. Descendants of the original villagers who wish to tend those graves must apply for permission and attend on the approved dates. On the days when the Army runs
As you can see here,
exercises,
the net value
there
of
are
the
helicopters
estate, after
overhead
reliefs and
and
exemptions,
soldiers in the
still
streets.
resulted in a substantial
A village
inheritance
that once
tax
had a
liability.
pub and a school and families eating breakfast now has people with rifles rehearsing the clearing of buildings.
We must
Tyneham
insist,
was
sir,
taken
these
and
premises are
preserved,
required for the duration.
like something in a jar. Imber was
Sergeant,
taken
ensure
and
the loading bay is
repurposed.
clear. Move
Both were
smartly now.
taken. That's the common thread. And in the next case, a different method was used entirely. One that leaves no ambiguity about the permanence of the decision. There are years, dry years, unusually dry, when the water level in the Lady Bower Reservoir drops far enough to reveal what's underneath. Stone walls, foundations, the shape of streets. People drive out from Sheffield and Derby and stand at the edge of the water taking photographs of what looks, at first glance,
must be the
like a
modification they
hallucination.
mentioned in the
It is
later
not a
survey.
hallucination. It's Derwent, and what's left of Ashopton. 2 villages that were inhabited, functional, alive, and then deliberately flooded to create a reservoir serving Sheffield, Derby and Leicester. The decision to build the Lady Bower Reservoir was made before the Second World War.
Yes, the light is perfect.
Over 140 families were moved out. The process took years.
We need
Some
the timber
residents were
raised to the
relocated
third
to a
level
newly
before
built
sundown.
village nearby.
Mine the scaffolding.
Others simply dispersed. The valley was flooded in 1943 and 1945 in stages. The church tower of Derwent was kept standing above the waterline for a time, then demolished in 1947 because it was drawing too many visitors and creating what the authorities described as a distraction. In 1959, before the final flooding of the upper section, the RAF's 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, used the valley to practice for a mission, low-level flight, following the contours of the reservoir. Men trained over the submerged rooftops of the village that had been cleared for them. When the drought comes and the water retreats, tourists stand at the edge and look at the stonework and feel something they struggle to name. It isn't quite grief. It isn't quite wonder. It's something in between. The recognition that the ground beneath ordinary life is less permanent than it appears. The next place understood that differently. What was buried there was not a village. It was a secret. Orford Ness is a shingle spit on the Suffolk coast, roughly 15 kilometers long, separated from the mainland by the River Orr. For 60 years, from 1913 to 1971, it was one of the most classified locations in Britain. They developed radar here in the 1930s. During the Cold War, they tested components of British nuclear weapons. Not the warheads themselves, but the triggering mechanisms, the environmental stress tests, the protocols for ensuring that a bomb would detonate when ordered and not before. The structures built to contain accidental nuclear detonations are still standing on the shingle. The locals call them the pagodas. The pagodas were designed with roofs engineered to collapse inward in the event of an explosion, containing the blast. The town of Orford is 2 kilometers away. Its residents, for the entirety of the Cold War, were never formally told what was being tested on the spit across the water. The official designation was Research Establishment. The workers who crossed the river each morning signed the Official Secrets Act and said nothing. The National Trust now manages the site. On certain days in summer, you can take a boat across and walk among the pagodas as they slowly rust. Some of the archival material has been declassified. Not all of it. The Trust is very clear about that. The records of certain programs remain restricted. The buildings that held those programs are open for walking around. The full contents of what happened inside them are not. Orford Ness is the only place on this list where the thing that was hidden was not the absence of people, but the presence of something that could have ended a great many of them. Which brings us finally to a village on the Devon coast where nobody hid anything. Where, in fact, the people most affected said exactly, specifically and clearly what was about to happen, and were ignored completely. In 1897, the Crown granted a license to a contractor named Sir John Jackson to dredge shingle from the beach at Hall Sands on the South Devon coast. The shingle was needed as aggregate for extensions to the Royal Naval Dockyard at Devonport, 40 miles west. The license was granted. The dredging began. 660,000 tons of beach were removed. The fishermen of Hall Sands, the men and women who had lived on that beach for generations, whose cottages sat directly on the shingle ridge that separated them from the sea, protested from the beginning. They wrote letters. They gave testimony. They explained, in plain terms, that the beach was the natural defense between the village and the Atlantic. They said that if the shingle was removed, the sea would take the village. The Board of Trade's engineer inspected the site in 1902 and confirmed that the dredging had already caused the beach to drop by over a meter. He recommended the license be suspended. The dredging continued for a time regardless. By then, it scarcely mattered. The damage was done. The natural armor of the beach was gone. On the night of the 26th of January 1917, a storm struck the Devon coast.
Built in 1888,
by morning,
is moments
29 of the 37 cottages at Hallson's had been destroyed. The sea came through walls that had nothing left to protect them. The village was gone in a single night. Compensation was paid. Eventually, after years of correspondence, the amounts were contested. One woman, Patience Worth, who had lived in Hall Sands
house
her
is
entire
gone,
life,
yet the deer
refused to
remain.
leave the ruins of her house.
These ancient herds move
She lived
across
alone in what remained of it until 1964, when she was in her 80s. By then, the sea had taken the floor. She ate at a table suspended over the water. Nobody was prosecuted. No official was held formally responsible. The government had granted the license, ignored the warnings, dismissed the protests,
Look at the
and
age
allowed
of
the
these
dredging
oaks. They
to
must be
continue
centuries old.
after its own
incredible
engineer
they've
confirmed
survived.
the
It feels
damage.
so peaceful here now.
When the storm came, it was classified as a natural disaster. 11 places, 11 different stories, 11 different causes, 11 different ways a community can be taken from the people who built it.
Some of them were economic
This heraldic
decisions.
crest, though heavily
Some were
weathered,
military.
stands as a permanent claim
Some
in
were
stone,
deliberate,
visible long
documented,
after the family who
signed
commissioned
off
it has
acts of
vanished.
state policy carried out against people who objected and were overruled. And some, Hall Sands, most clearly, were catastrophes
Sealed
that
by
happened
time and
precisely
nature,
because
the
a
ice
government
house
chose
stands
to
as a
leave
tangible
its
link to a lost Victorian way of life.
In isolation, the boathouse endures.
What
long
connects them
after
is
the
not
grand country
architecture.
house it served
It's not
has
geography.
vanished completely.
It's the distance, in each case, between the people who made the decision and the people who had to live with it. Most of these places don't appear in the guidebooks. They're not on the heritage trail. Nobody has put up interpretive boards explaining what happened, or why, or who was responsible. The records exist, in archives, in court documents,
So
in
the Great
letters
Hall was
written by
here,
people who
and the
knew
chapel was
exactly
just
what was
beyond it,
coming
according to this map.
and couldn't make anyone listen.
It's much clearer now.
They're there.
Shall we head this way?
If you look, the last image isn't a ruin. It's a note pinned to a church door in Dorset in December 1943,
See the detail in
asking
the
whoever
carving up
found
there.
it to take care
This
of the
room was
village
likely
until
the
the
Great
people
Hall.
came back. They never did. The note is still there, behind glass, in the church that the Ministry of Defence allows you to visit on certain Sundays. It's the most precise summary of everything you've just seen. Someone asked to be remembered and was answered with policy.